A great evening to one and all who've taken time to join us here. Today, the 10th of October, is observed as World Mental Health Day across the globe. The Postdoctoral Fellow Association takes this opportunity to not just remind us all about the mental health issues, but to facilitate an open conversation among the experts for deciphering a holistic and a sustainable approach that can be integrated into the Indian research ecosystem for nurturing mental resilience in young research scholars. I am Sri Divya, a postdoctoral fellow at INSTEM, joined by co-moderator Aditya, a postdoctoral fellow at NCBS. We are here in an attempt to voice the thoughts of the young scholars community. Let me begin with a brief introduction to what inspired our team to invite you all for the discussion today. The stringent screening of youth at the entry points into research ensures that bright minds are offered the opportunity. However, it is becoming increasingly evident that somewhere along their initial journey into the research world, their mental health takes a huge toll. Multiple factors lead to the mental health issues that range from stress to anxiety to depression, and at times have also ended up in suicide. Mental health issues in the academia and research community is prevalent across the globe and seems to plague a large number of young scholars, including PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. It is indeed a positive sign that this issue is being openly acknowledged and discussed within the community in the recent years. Few important suggestions that are often recommended include socializing, changing lifestyle, and consulting counselors. As much as it is easy to state these suggestions, without the concerted efforts of the institute heads, faculty, and students who comprise the immediate professional network of any scholar in an institution, these solutions may be far-fetched. To discuss all of these, we have three experts in our panel today. Aditya, my co-moderator, would introduce the speakers now. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Sridivya. Our first panel member, Professor K. Vijayaraghavan, who is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India and is also a distinguished faculty at NCBS. Prior to this, he has served as a Deputy Secretary and as a Director of NCBS. Our second panel member is Professor Vidita Vaidya, who is a professor at TIFR Mumbai. She was a former Senior Research Fellow of the Wellcome Trust and a former Associate of the Indian Academy of Sciences. Her primary areas of research are neuroscience and molecular psychiatry. Our third panel member is Professor John, who is a professor of psychiatry at NIMHANS, Bangalore. He studies the neurobiology of different degenerative diseases and cognitive states of mind. He is the faculty in charge of Multimodal Brain Image Analysis Laboratory and Center for Brain Mapping at NIMHANS. We are delighted to welcome all the panel members who agreed to join in today's discussion. We gladly welcome the audience and encourage them to participate by typing their thoughts, suggestions, and questions in the Q&A chat box. We now request Professor Raghavan to share his thoughts about the prevailing status of the mental health of young scholars and initiate the discussion for today. Over to you, Professor Raghavan.
Thank you very much, Aditya, Srividya, and Pavitra. And it's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues, Vidita and John. This topic today about resilience in mental health in our research context is perhaps one of the most important topics and, of course, least discussed for a variety of reasons. It's also not easy for people to discuss it because, as Srividya so nicely put it, the answers on what to do are easy, but the solutions, i.e. the implementation, is very, very complex. And so we are in a bit of a bind because we know in theory what needs to be done, but in practice, each context requires special attention. So what exactly are the issues which come up? And they come up fundamentally at a very difficult time when we grow up. Adolescence is a period where not only are there extraordinary changes going on in our brains from a neurobiological point of view, but also in our behavior, our ambitions, our drives, and everything else. It is confronted with what we want to do as individuals, what we think we can do, with expectations from our family and from our peer group. And the fact of the matter is, no matter whether someone says this or not, this is a major stress for everyone. Aditya, could you mute yourself? There's a little bit of feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an enormous amount of expectation growing up. It's very well to say that the school or entry level to college should be more understanding of this. And, there are different people have different talents. And therefore, if you don't get into one place, there's always the other place. All of that is perfectly true and valid. In practice, when it comes down to each of us, there is no denying that this stage in one's life is a stage of enormous stress, i.e. before you get into college and soon after you get into college. This is not new. This has been there for decades. I felt it immensely growing up. And the feeling of inadequacy only increases at every step. When I was at school, I had this mistaken notion that I was reasonably good at certain things. But the moment you go into college and find everyone 10 times better than you on most everything, that's a big balloon which is immediately punctured, and you have to deal with this. There are all sorts of other things which we need to deal with. There are some of us who are introverts, some of us who are extroverts, but behind everyone who appears to be an extrovert is, again, a lot of stress and tension which we have. Growing up in school, when we were asked to read a paragraph from a book and the next person reads the next paragraph, I could count when my turn came which paragraph I would have to start reading. But 9 times out of 10, I was tongue-tied and could not start. So I had a stutter, I had to devise ways, and this was deep anxiety. It wasn't that I had a speech problem which was always there. It was always there when I had to speak up. So I had to devise a way by which I would start the paragraph with something which was not there in the book, and then I found I could continue. So people adopt these tricks to survive stressful situations, not just reading, but everything else. And therefore, when you see people who are seemingly comfortable, they're also dealing with these complex situations. So first point is that the uncertainty of youth is common. It is a source of difficulty for everyone. Some people show it more than others. Some people show it by being more interactive, others by being less interactive, some by bullying, others are bullied. And these are all the spheres of young people growing up. So this is the sort of tapestry we have. And as our interactive spaces have increased in volume, the attention to individuals tends to go down. And therefore, our schools, our colleges have so many more people, each one of them, that the attention to someone who needs talking to or being with goes down. Again, when I was growing up, any one of us who clearly was uncomfortable was approached by someone else in a generous manner, and a conversation was had because time and access was more feasible. So how do we do that in a situation where there are a very large number of people? After one goes past college, deciding to take on an intellectual enterprise or an intellectual activity such as research is something, again, which is not quote unquote normal. Most people rightly have a great pressure both by the peer community and from family, to take up jobs which are mainstream and are productive in terms of remuneration or social perception, right? So I was interested in doing electrical engineering, but my father's colleague said that plastics have a future, so do chemical engineering. So that kind of a peer pressure decides what one does, and you get onto that. But afterwards, you wade into research in a manner because many of us as young people don't know that you want to do research or not. Very few extremely smart people might be very clear they want to do that. Many of us, like I did, go into it because we haven't thought too deeply about the real world. And therefore, not only are you, have the uncertainty of youth, but you have layered on it a uncertainty in decision making. Society expects people to be very clear on what they want to do, try that, get it done, go ahead. And many of us who get into research don't want to take that decision early. And that indecisiveness, if it takes you into an area of work, such as research, which actually requires an enormous amount of focus and thinking and analysis, you're coming in relatively cold. And therefore, this doesn't help your, comfort substantially. And again, small nurturing environments, small in number of people, detect this. They see what is strong in you, what is not, and enhance the strength, the strong aspects. Try to see how teaching and other interactions can help the other aspects, and so you manage over there. And here too, our research enterprises have grown so large that this kind of attention to the unusual person who requires interactions more than others is not substantially, structurally, easily feasible. So we need to explore how that can be done. So that is the second kind of uncertainty which is there. After this uncertainty of youth and then the area of research you take on, comes the uncertainty of the future. Again, the volume of the enterprise, this large number of people finishing their PhDs and so on, has resulted in an enormous amount of competition in quote unquote the market, and therefore a future is no longer easy. And even more, there is a peer pressure that certain kinds of jobs in certain kinds of places are the A-grade jobs, and if you get something else, then you are at a lower level. This is a dangerous trend. It's further enhanced by the pressures, real and self-imposed, which senior people in research put on themselves, and they want to succeed, and they see students and postdocs as vehicles for their success, as opposed to partners in a quest. And this also doesn't aid the mental health of people around. And finally, the peer pressure conflates very substantially the numbers of hours spent at work, the way one interacts with others. Do you put your hand first in a seminar like the smartest person in the front row? How fast you respond to a question as opposed to thinking through it? All these put undue pressure. Now, this is not to say that all of this results in an environment which is, a big block on one's head and miserable and so on. Not at all. If you look across campuses in India and campuses across the world, there are extraordinary places, even under very difficult circumstances, where camaraderie and the interactions among people between faculty and the administration and staff, all of which are very good. These are the places, even if they are relatively few in number, to emulate. Even within these places, there would be a range of different kinds of environments. Some departments are more interactive than others. What can we learn from them? Some institutions are more interactive, more user-friendly than others. What can we learn from them? It's not necessarily only because of resources and flexibilities there, but it's also important to keep in mind the physical environment also makes an important role over here. If you have, and in our country, it's certainly feasible, right from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Assam to Gujarat, there are many months of the year where we can sit out in the open or see each other come and go. Open environments where you see people, where you talk to each other are very important. Open canteens where everyone, no matter what position they have in the institution, can come and eat and talk to each other and mix, and sometimes learn about each other's strengths and problems and issues. Those are very, very important. So institutionally, that can also be done. But fundamentally, I think it is very important. I'll conclude by saying what the role of the principal investigator and the institution is that, while they themselves might be at stress for a variety of reasons, it doesn't help transferring that to your students and postdocs at all. In fact, the role of every layer of the administration is to protect the layers below so that you convey and protect them to do the best they can, but not convey the stress down to them. So the role of the PI is to protect their groups and have them interactive in a happy way. The role of the deans would be to make sure that there is sufficient interactions amongst PIs and not one set feels bullied or threatened or pushed by the other. And similarly, the head of the institution needs to protect the institution so that the external environment's fluctuations don't impact on internal functioning. So I'll stop here and be happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Professor Raghavan, for the very nicely laid overview. Sridivya, over to you now.
So let's now get into the depths of the mental health issues. To do that, I think we need to start addressing specific points in detail. So I now turn to the neurobiologist in our panel, Professor Vidita. Could you please shed some light on what exactly is stress and what are the different aspects in a research ecosystem and the different aspects in the academia that may lead to stress?
Thank you, Sridivya, and thank you, Aditya, for asking me to be part of this panel. I think it's such a critically important discussion. I'm a neurobiologist that studies the neurobiology of stress and circuits in the brain that regulate emotion, but I do this in rodent models. So I should put my caveat out very first and foremost and say that's the system I'm most comfortable addressing. But I think there are some insights one can get from studying stress neurobiology as a whole and in general. And I'm going to raise some of those points and see if we can see why those points might actually come up in, in work environments that we are speaking about. So a couple of years back, Nature did this, I think it was a Nature publishing group, did this survey where they were looking at mental health, disorders or even events of a major mental health crises amongst the graduate student community. And while this was still fairly lopsided towards the West, their numbers turned up percentages along the lines of 40% of graduate students. I remember reading this and being quite appalled because this is almost double what is seen in the general population. And I was struck by the fact that if something is twice the number of what it is in the general population, then that's quite worrying because it's telling you something about the work environment. It's telling you that there's something here that seems to potentially be precipitating either one of two things. You're sub-selecting out a bunch of people who happen to have a higher risk, or you have something in the environment that is precipitating a much higher rate of mental health crisis and challenges. And this then raises the fundamental question, is something that we're doing going wrong in our work environments and on campuses across the world? It would be really nice to have similar surveys for India. And I know India Biosciences, Life of Science have been spearheading those kinds of efforts and those kind of conversations, which I think are very important. So I'm going to raise a few points. I wrote an article for the Life of Science with my graduate student, Prachi Tiwari, and that was actually very useful because it was a back and forth conversation with her where we were just talking about what might be special within working environments on campuses that might create specific situations that precipitate mental health crises. So one of the things that we talked about is that, we select people after a very strict selection process where everyone has worked really hard to get in. They've done academically excellently through their entire education. And then they show up on campus, and now there are expectations of not just their own, but the expectation of their entire family that Vijay also referred to, which they carry on their shoulders. But our systems and our education systems rarely prepare us for failure. In fact, failure has always been viewed as something that we brushed underneath the carpet, we didn't admit, we always pushed away. And failure is inbuilt to research enterprises. By definition, there is no way you can do research if you don't embrace failure and accept that it's actually part of the process of doing science. And we rarely talk about it. We rarely share how we've navigated our own failures. So the first thing I would say that perhaps one could do in these environments that would make it a little bit easier is to share how we have failed. And I mean this from the point of view of mentors, from people who are a little bit further ahead in the journey. When we share our own challenges, when we drop our guard and reveal our own vulnerability, we let younger people who are coming in know that they are not unusual. They're not the only one who's feeling this way. So that would be the first thing I would say, that there is a requirement to perhaps drop one's guard and have a conversation and say, you are not the only one who's felt this way. Many of us have. And because there is this sense of distancing between people who are further ahead of you in the journey, where you look at them and say, but they seem to have everything sorted out. And I'm the only one who's feeling this way. This feeling of being the only one who's potentially feeling vulnerable is something that one can work towards reducing. And that requires people at all steps in the journey to perhaps share their own stories. The other thing I think that is rather problematic is our steep power equations. On all research campuses, we have very steep power equations. Students go to labs. There's a bit of a toss of the coin in the lab that you pick also, and whether that will work out to be a really great student mentor or a postdoctoral fellow mentor relationship. And we perhaps do not recognize the value of how important that relationship is in determining how you will handle the crises that would inevitably come. So life circumstances, crises, situations in life, even failure are going to come. You can't prevent those. But how you navigate them often depends very strongly on your support system and on the relationships you develop with people around you. Too much emphasis is put on that one equation, which is your advisor, your mentor. That is lopsidedly high, and that individual then plays a very, very strong role in determining how you will navigate this. This is problematic, in my opinion, and needs to be diffused in some way. It can be diffused by diluting those power equations, by providing some sort of power back to the student community. And that can be done by changing institutional practices of how we are evaluated. Our evaluations are based on our publications. Our evaluations are based on our productivity. But a huge part of the scientific journey is mentorship. And who you train in your next generation is as much a mark of who you are as a scientist as the papers you will publish in your short career. I mean, you are here 20, 30 years, you will publish, but the seeds that you sow go on far further. And we don't use that as part of our evaluation criteria, which is mentorship. The caliber and quality of how you run your group and the manner in which you nurture young minds is as important a component of evaluation. I believe that if we found institutional way to bring that in, it would act as a somewhat of a check and balance. Of course, widening who the term mentor refers to. It shouldn't be just one individual. There are multiple people who can mentor you. And if we flatten that a little bit, it will provide young people coming in with alternative people that they can turn to when they face a challenge, just in case one person doesn't fit that bill. Okay, so that's the second point that I want to raise. Steep power equations, I believe, are a serious problem. And I think that if one resolves some of those, you would really see institutional reform that would tackle this problem. The other thing is imposter syndrome. We don't openly admit it, but most of us wonder, how did I end up here? Somebody must have made a mistake. Why did they pick me? Why am I even being recognized? it's just fluke, and they'll figure out that I actually don't know what I'm talking about at all. And that's a feeling that has been commonly had by many people in science. We don't talk about it as openly, and because the distance between people who are feeling that way and people ahead of them in that journey, I can't think of a single person who went through graduate school who didn't at some point in their second or third year hold their head and say, I have no idea why I signed on for this. I think it's impossible to not have had that feeling. At some stage in your career, you would have asked yourself, oh my God, every experiment I've done for the last 6 months has failed. I remember feeling this way in my third year and, having had failed experiment after failed experiment and wondering whether I was just perhaps not capable of doing those experiments. And things do turn around, and they turn around, but you need other people to tell you that hang in there. Hang in there through this stretch, because you're not the only one who's feeling this way. So imposter syndrome and acknowledging it and then dropping one's guard would be very important. In animal models, there is a model that we refer to, which is routinely used for studying mood-related disorders. It's a term which I like, which is called learned helplessness. And that term is a valuable term because it also tells us many times in life how when one is faced with a challenge that one cannot solve, that one generalizes that to every situation, to presume that, oh, this has been really bad, this was a really negative experience, and now every experience going forth is going to be equally bad. And you generalize one negative round of experience to multiple experiences. And that sometimes happens because you may not do well on your qualifying exam, let's say. And that becomes an indictment of how you feel. Or perhaps as a postdoctoral fellow, your first big project doesn't work and you are struggling. And then you presume that the next thing you take on, you will not be able to do as well. And so this feeling of learned helplessness that we tend to sometimes see, and then that generalizes to multiple situations, is also something I think that one can deal with if one tackles it head on and it's discussed. And I'm, of course, talking about situations that are at the milder end of the spectrum. These are things that many of us feel, but they can also precipitate serious psychiatric issues and challenges. And I'm sure Professor John will touch upon that as we go further down into this panel discussion. I think the other thing is safe spaces. One cannot emphasize this enough. Your working space has to be a safe space, which means you must feel you are safe in your environment. This may apply to multiple people, but I can certainly think of many women who would worry about whether their working space is genuinely a safe space. And sexual harassment is one serious component of it. When you don't have a safe space, there is no way you can actually do the work that you are seeking to do. So the provision of safe spaces and the requirement of safe spaces is absolutely essential. The idea of who your allies are in this journey is another equally important one. Your allies are multiple people. It could be someone you never anticipated as an ally, but you will find allies in the most interesting of places. And I think seeking out allies is deeply valuable. You might find someone who just happens to be, walking around doing some bird watching or walking around doing something, and you and strike up a conversation, and that person is not perhaps doing the work that you're doing, but they end up becoming an ally because they're interested in what you're up to. You have common interests. I think the idea of having allies within your lab and beyond is absolutely crucial. Social isolation, I think that's another big one. I mean, COVID, if anything, is a great example of what our species cannot handle. And if we do this, it does create crises, no question about it. And so in laboratories, when you're believing that you're the single person who's going to do everything and solve stuff, and sometimes that doesn't happen, you do need your allies, your collaborators, your friends, your mentor, others. You need to have that interaction. You need to blow off steam. You need to have other things that you do to blow off steam. Retain a hobby. Retain a hobby. You will find joys in that surprise you remarkably, right? The other thing I would say is a critical one is that for a PI or a mentor, let people know that they matter, not just their productivity. Because if you convert that individual into simply an output that you will measure, you're taking away from the primary reason that you are invested in them, which is them as people eventually. And I think that matters to people. And when they feel the sense of having been invested in as human beings, then they will surmount multiple crises because people believe in them. Beyond that, I would say it's an honor for us to work in science. I mean, we are being paid by taxpayers to do something that we all love to do. The fact that we have that is itself quite a remarkable thing. We are part of a journey of scientists that have been, asking questions about nature for hundreds of years. It is an honor to be part of that. Don't lose sight of that. And I think as mentors, pass that on, because one paper will come and another paper will go. Your impact factors will be irrelevant in a period of time. But the joy that you got in the process of discovery, especially the shared joy of the process of discovery of a team, is rather remarkable and very special. And those moments are well worth holding on to and celebrating, because when you do, then you buffer the next one where things go wrong, which they will. You buffer that much better. And I would say you can't often change your circumstances. They are what they are, but your response is in your control. And you can choose to titrate that response. But as communities, as individuals who are part of the science ecosystem, and as institutions, there are things we can absolutely do to make it better. We need to neutralize that steep power equation. We need to give some power back to our youngest people who will determine how science and science trajectories will go for the next 50 years or more. They cannot feel so powerless. And if that has to happen, there has to be criteria that are set in place that allow some checks and balances to come in. And I think that's it. I would say the little bit of advice I would give is an advice that I've received myself. Someone once told me, I don't remember who said it, but someone once told me, take your work seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. And if we collectively start doing that, I mean, we will create much better environments for most people in science. We take our work seriously, we don't have to take ourselves so seriously. And that's what I have to say. And I'm looking forward to interacting and chatting with everybody.
Thank you, Professor Viditya. That was quite comprehensive. In fact, the next question for me was to ask about how to handle it in a research ecosystem, and I think you've already elaborated on those points. So, as you rightly mentioned, we would now look into the clinical aspects of what underlies the mental health issues, for which I would request Aditya to invite Professor John. Yeah.
Many thanks, Sridivya. Understanding the different types of mental disturbances and phases of symptoms experienced by a person with mental stress would be important to this discussion. I request our mental health expert, Professor John, to elaborate on these points.
Am I audible, Aditya?
Yes, Professor. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Very good evening to all of you. And let me begin by first thanking the Postdoctoral Fellows Association of NCBS, specifically the representatives Aditya and Sridivya, for kindly inviting me for this very important discussion on stress and its effects on mental ill health. Personally, I consider this as an honor to participate in a panel discussion with Professor Vijay Raghavan and Professor Viditya Vaidya. What I'm going to hope to do would be to touch upon the effect of stress on mental health. And as the figure from a recent paper shows here, that environmental stress interacts with the genome of a particular individual, causing epigenomic changes, resulting in changes in physiology and behavior, and which leads to stable alterations in the DNA structure, altered gene expression, and finally leads on to depressive and other psychiatric symptoms, which is the topic of today's discussion. But before we move into the ill effects of stress, let's remember that stress is not always bad. You have good stress and bad stress, and all of us know how suddenly the appearance of a deadline just transforms us from an inactive and bored state to being motivated, being focused, and produce our peak performance and meet our targets. And that is referred to as eustress. It motivates you, it helps you to focus and improves your performance. We feel completely in control and we feel that we can totally handle this. But stress, when persists over a long time, with continued deadlines and an unforgiving environment, can make us feel fatigued, lead us on to feeling exhausted, having anxiety symptoms and bouts of panic, which might later affect our behavior with others, causing anger in our behavior. And finally, it might lead on to burnout and breakdown. So this is referred to as distress. Now, distress causes various kinds of psychiatric symptoms. It can be perceived by the individual as overwhelming, and it in fact decreases your performance. Now, it is important for all of us as researchers to be aware of the early warning signs of distress, because that is where we can probably change things and probably prevent further downstream events from happening in our own mental state and, of course, in our performance. Some of the early warning signs of distress include cognitive symptoms like inability to concentrate, memorize, having a poor judgment, seeing generally the negative side of things, having anxiety or constant worrying, or emotional symptoms like feeling sad, feeling anxious all the time, being irritable or moody, having a sense of being overwhelmed by the situation or being lonely and isolated, and so on. It can also reflect as behavioral symptoms like change in your eating patterns, your sleeping patterns, your social interactions, your general tendency for procrastinating or neglecting responsibilities. You are feeling that you can only feel relaxed if you take some substances like alcohol or other drugs, or you might probably feel fidgety all the time and indulge in certain nervous habits like nail biting and pacing up and down. Now, distress can not only cause cognitive, emotional, and behavioral symptoms, but it can also cause physical symptoms. It can impair our immune system. It can probably produce various kinds of bodily symptoms like aches and pains, diarrhea, constipation, frequent attacks of infection, heart rate increasing, chest pain, loss of sex drive, and so on and so forth. Now, the psychiatric disorders rest on a stress diathesis model, wherein the stress related to the immediate environment or the developmental environment interacts with the innate genetic vulnerability for the particular disorder, causing the development of the disorder. And we know that the stronger the genetic diathesis, the less stress is necessary to produce the disorder. Now, what are the common kind of psychiatric disorders which can be precipitated or aggravated by stress? In fact, all psychiatric disorders, or for that matter, all neurological conditions, or even other medical conditions can be precipitated or aggravated in a given individual depending upon the interaction between the genes and the environment that I was referring to earlier. But specifically, some of the more common psychiatric disorders which are seen in relation to stress are anxiety disorders, which include adjustment disorders, so disorders of adjustment to a particular work environment, life environment, or a catastrophic stress causing an acute stress reaction in a given individual. Generalized anxiety disorders, feeling of not being able to relax and having a persistent experience of worrying and tension. Panic disorders, sudden bouts of excessive anxiety, or other neurotic disorders. I'll not go into the details of those. One can also experience mood disorders as secondary to stress, which include major depressive disorders or dysthymia or mixed anxiety and depressive disorders, which are slightly subsyndromal depressive disorders, or bipolar affective disorders, wherein you have the experience of episodes of depression alternating with episodes of excitement, or what we refer to as mania. Can also lead to substance use disorders, wherein, as I was referring to earlier, the individual uses substances consistently for obtaining relaxation, and later will not be able to do without those, leading on to addiction. Now, of course, there's this technology addiction as well. Now, psychotic disorders, including acute psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, delusion disorders, may also be precipitated or aggravated by stress. Insomnia is one of the very common, outcomes of the stress affecting a given individual. Of course, the erratic patterns of sleep caused by various new age gadgets and all that will contribute to this. Now, stress can also exacerbate pre-existing personality traits or disorders. And finally, very importantly, stress can also lead on to thoughts of ending one's life or attempting to kill oneself. Now, how do we recognize these early warning symptoms of psychiatric disorders? Just like we have seen how to recognize early signs of distress. Now, some individuals in the face of stress might experience persistent feelings of apprehension, worries, feeling on the edge, inability to concentrate or relax, having headaches or lightheadedness, having other autonomic symptoms like sweating, palpitations, fast breathing, dizziness, or gastrointestinal symptoms like dry mouth or gastric discomfort, and so on. Now, of course, all of us have experienced these symptoms at varying points of time in our life, at various situations. However, if these symptoms persist over a period of time, consistently, almost on a daily basis or many days a week, over many weeks on end or months on end, then one would want to be thinking that they might probably be having an underlying anxiety disorder. Similarly, with mood disorders, if you experience persistent feelings of low mood with decreased interest in activities which previously gave you pleasure, your hobbies, and so on and so forth, or a consistent feeling of fatigue, feeling low about oneself, feeling being unworthy, or feeling guilty, or having reduced concentration, or even thoughts or ideas of self-harming, and along with disturbances in sleep and appetite. And if these persist for at least a period of 2 weeks on end, then one might want to consider that you might probably be going through an episode of depression. Now, of course, I have not mentioned here the symptoms, early warning symptoms of mania, which is exactly the opposite of this: feeling excessively happy, excessively cheerful, hyper-energetic, feeling restless, talking excessively, and taking poor decisions with no sleep and feeling pretty energetic despite having no sleep, and so on. That is referred to as mania. Now, stress can also bring on a strong desire to use drugs of abuse to feel relaxed. And when used in a sustained and persistent manner, the individual might find it difficult to control the use of the drug, almost neglecting alternate pleasures or interests, and also feels like he or she has to use progressively increasing amounts to have the same effect as they used to in the past. And finally, people who are truly addicted to medications, these drugs, would experience withdrawal symptoms when the drug use is reduced or stopped. Now, some of the early warning symptoms of psychotic disorders, which essentially mean a derangement of ties with reality, is that the person might feel that other people around them are meaning harm to them. Their lab mates might be meaning harm to them, and the PI gives them a deadline. They might think that the PI is specifically picking on me because the PI does not like me, and so on and so forth. And the research scholar might withdraw himself or herself from the environment, may experience difficulties in thinking and speaking clearly, difficulty in experiencing and expressing emotions, and also in more severe cases may have beliefs that are not grounded in reality, which is referred to as delusions, or experiences that are inexplicable and scary. These are referred to as hallucinations, or these also include the experience of other forces interfering with one's own thoughts, body sensations, and so on. I've mentioned earlier that insomnia can be a very common accompaniment of hyperstress or distress, which can lead on to difficulty falling asleep, or frequent awakenings during sleep, or waking up substantially earlier than usual, which is typically seen in major depressive disorder. Now, stress can also exacerbate certain pre-existing personality traits. All of us have our own personality traits. Majority of individuals who are well adjusted with their environments have more adaptive personality traits as compared to others who may have experienced difficulties in adjusting to their environment. For example, individuals with anxious avoidant personality who experience persistent feelings of anxiety and avoid social situations, or people with emotionally unstable personality disorder who have dramatic emotional perturbations when faced with mundane life situations, or people with paranoid personality who are unable to trust other people and ascribe malified intent to other people's neutral behaviors, or dependent personality, for example, people who feel very insecure and unable to make their own decisions and feel very overwhelmed when they have to be on their own. So these kind of personality, pre-existing personality traits can be aggravated by the experience of stress. Finally, of course, this is something that is, of course, attracted a lot of attention, especially during this pandemic period, suicidal thoughts and self-harm acts. So we can see here that India falls in the bracket of countries with more than 20 to 25 per 100,000 suicides in the population. Now, suicide should not be just considered as an isolated response to a stressful event. There are certain distal factors, including genetic and epigenetic changes that I was referring to earlier, a family history of suicide, early life adversity, all of this leading on to lasting alterations in gene expressions, which may be manifested as some of the abnormal personality traits that I was referring to, which might include impulsive aggression and a tendency for experiencing negative emotions, also having cognitive deficits. And this might be complicated by chronic substance use, along with the genetic and epigenetic factors, leading on to increased vulnerability to even stressful situations which other people are able to deal with. And more proximally, a particular life event, presence of psychiatric disorder in that given individual, for example, mood disorder or psychotic disorder, along with the biological and psychological and other genetic factors also interacting with substance dependence, can lead on to experiences of depression and dysregulated mood and hopelessness and the learned helplessness that Professor Vidita was referring to, leading on to acts of self-harm with intent to die or thoughts about death, and finally, the suicidal acts. And so in the US, it is about 10.6 per 100,000 population. And in India, as I was referring to, it's about 20 to 25 per 100,000 population. So it's a very important public health challenge. And it's very important for us as researchers, as Dr. Vidita was mentioning, that we seem to be a group of people who might be more at risk for experiencing these difficulties and also experiencing distress to the extent that it might lead on to thoughts or acts of self-harm. So what are the warning signs? One must know the warning signs. The warning signs would include talking about wanting to die or to kill oneself, looking for a way to kill oneself, either expressing that or checking for that online or checking with other people, feeling hopeless or having no purpose in life, persistent drug or alcohol use, deranged sleep patterns, feeling anxious and agitated all the time, showing rage or talking about seeking revenge. So if you notice any of this in oneself, or if you notice any of this in your colleague, you might probably not want to turn the other way, but instead you might bring yourself to have the courage to ask some of these questions. Now, if you were to ask, do you ever think about suicide? Many people would think that, well, would that precipitate a suicidal act? The clinical and research studies show otherwise. Very often, the person who is suicidal feels a sense of relief that somebody is able to understand that I'm going through this mental state. So please, of course, you need to ask it in a manner which is compassionate. And you can even go on to ask, once you have a positive response from the other individual, do you have a plan to kill yourself? Have you attempted suicide before? Have you thought about when you would do it? Have you thought about what method you would use? Are you seeing a doctor or mental health professional regularly? All of this would give us an idea about how imminent and critical is the danger to your peer's life. And there are certain do's and don'ts that you would want to keep in mind when interacting with the person in distress. Let the person talk and listen to them without judgment, rather than trying to minimize the problem or tell the person, well, this is not something that you want to want to consider ending your life about. Reassure them that treatment and help is available, rather than trying to convince the person that this is not something for which you don't have to take any help. Tell them what they are experiencing is treatable and that suicidal feelings are temporary, rather than preaching about how suicide is bad. Okay, if the person has a plan to hurt or kill themselves and you fear they are in imminent danger, make sure that you just do not say that, okay, you just go and meet with a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Instead, stay with the person and get them to the nearest emergency department. Or if you are not proximal to this individual, then make sure that you keep the conversation going on and then seek parallel options of getting help for this individual. Now you can see that there are a lot of suicide helplines in Bangalore, starting from the Nimhan Center for Wellbeing, and there are various other NGOs who answer calls 24/7. Nimhan's does not have a 24/7 helpline, but it is there during all the working days. But other helplines, the numbers that are available here pretty much work on a 24/7 timeline. Now, what can a researcher do to prevent distress? The most important part is to educate oneself about stress rather than saying that it does not exist. And then one should motivate oneself to act on distress or avoid distress. Of course, whenever you find yourself in a difficult situation, a stressful situation, a simple technique like deep breathing very often helps to stabilize physical discomfort and mental tension. Chart out all the factors that may be causing or aggravating stress for you and identify maladaptive behaviors within yourself that would be causing stress. For example, always complaining about your work environment, your peers, your difficult situations, your failed lab experiments, and so on and so forth. The more you talk about this, the more negative you feel about oneself. Instead, try and fill your thought clouds with more positive charges, more positive thoughts, and give yourself positive self-affirmations. Learn from others who have failed and succeeded, like how Dr. Vidita was mentioning. Find out a method of energizing your body and mind through use of meditative practices. Now, all meditation may not suit everyone. Try and find your meditation that might help you. It might be yoga, it might be any other form of meditation. It can be music, or it can be other techniques like walking, hobbies, pets, socializing. Socializing not just about your lab experiments and so on, but about neutral topics and other common interests, writing a diary and so on. Now, so we try our best to avoid distress, but we might still need to decide when to consult someone. So when in distress, despite all of this, you experience distress and the symptoms of distress that I was referring to earlier, we should consult. And whom do we consult? Let's start talking to close friends with whom you can open up. Talk to your mentor, talk to your family. If you're still in distress, then talk to your student counselor. Take the advice of the counselor who would be able to assess and see if there are already evidences of early psychiatric disorders for whom a consultation with a formal consultation with a trained mental health professional might be required. Now, if you have some of the early warning symptoms of psychiatric disorder that I was referring to earlier, you must consult a psychiatrist. You need to decide whether it could be, you could wait for an outpatient consultation, or you must go into the ER, emergency room, for an emergency consultation if the situation warrants immediate interventions. For example, acute suicidal thought, an acute stress reaction, a panic disorder, or substance use. Complications related to substance use, and so on and so forth. Once you've been evaluated at the ER or at the outpatient setting, a multidisciplinary treatment approach would be initiated involving clinical psychologist, social worker, family therapist, psychiatric nurse, and so on. So why should you consult early? It is important to know that, as we have seen, the signs of distress, if left unattended, may lead to psychological, physical, and occupational and other dysfunctions. It would not just go away. Early warning signs of psychiatric disorders, if neglected, might lead to worsening of the condition, and which leads to greater challenges in recovering from the disorder. It might require greater amount of medications, more number of medications, and so on, and probably it takes longer to improve. And one should always remember that most of the major psychiatric conditions, if not properly treated, may carry a high risk of suicide, about 5 to 15% of lifetime risk of suicide, majority of the psychiatric conditions. So in summary, we have seen that stress may not be always bad. There is good stress, which is eustress. So therefore, the moment you start experiencing stress, don't think that it is going to drive you down the path of distress and difficulties. But you can probably thrive from the the stress, and that is referred to as the eustress. But if you are unable to, then you might experience distress. And there are methods by which you can adopt healthy patterns, lifestyles, and coping strategies to prevent distress. But despite your best measures, if you experience signs of distress that we have referred to earlier, then make the necessary adaptations, taking help from those close to you personally and professionally. But if you still keep experiencing distress, don't hesitate to consult your student counselor. And of course, monitor self to see if there are any early warning signs of psychiatric disorders that I was referring to, and seek help early. And be aware of the early warning signs of suicidal tendencies and act decisively to keep yourself safe and also to be a gatekeeper for your peers. So finally, this is the last slide. So just a couple of take-home points. So we have seen that it's not the stress that kills us, rather it is our reaction to it. This is Hans Selye, who is a very important psychoneuroendocrinologist, who has in fact coined the term eustress, who has given this statement. I think it's a very important statement for us to carry home. And we also understand and recognize that you can't control what goes on outside, but you can always control what goes on inside. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor John, for nicely discussing about stress, its different types, different symptoms, and how one should try to deal with it. I would like Sridivya now to initiate the discussion on the next point.
Yeah. Thank you, Aditya. So, Professor Vidita had briefly mentioned that it would be great if supervisors can actually share that, that team members are important. We would like Professor Vijay to actually delve a little deeper to say what all a supervisor can do to ensure that the mental resilience of their team members is intact.
First of all, thank you very much, Srividya. As we discussed, it's really wonderful, by the way, to hear what Vidita and John had to say. And I think that covers a lot of ground. As I started by saying, talking about the uncertainties of the early stage, to that, Vidita also layered on the importance of addressing what she termed as the imposter syndrome. Coming into graduate school, for example, all of us feel suddenly very inadequate because we see others around us who seem to be so much better, little knowing that they also feel inadequate. I think it's very valuable if the PI points out how they feel about themselves at every stage of their career. The difficulties all of us have are not addressed by being overconfident. Science is always about questioning, and therefore we are constantly questioning ourselves also. So that comfort zone is firstly important. Secondly, different people coming into the lab, to the institution, have different rates of acclimatization into the environment. And therefore one must be extremely understanding of that. To expect, again, because of pressures which a PI might face, that you want the student to hit the ground running in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months would be completely incorrect. Some students, really do wonderful work after they move around from different approaches to experiment and theory and, mess around and find the right one. They might take a year, they might take 2 years, or they might take 3 years. The next point is about, the structures which institutions put in. Institutions, as they get larger and larger, put in important, from their perspective, structures such as comprehensive exams. And these tend to be, needless stresses on individuals. What is the purpose of a comprehensive exam? Is to make sure that the student has a comprehensive understanding. But it's not a test akin to your bachelor's or your master's test. So it should be structured in a different way, which is more understanding. And, if you go back and forth a couple of times, it shouldn't be considered a big deal. It should be very clear that, look, this is a way by which we want to tune your skills in a better way, but you will carry on. So these are the kinds of institutional and PI-driven steps which can be readily done in most institutions. Many of them do it. The concern I have is that quite often, as institutions become larger, committees which do these kinds of things have a more welcoming environment, tend to become more structured as committees. Individuals don't know each other. They walk into a meeting, take a decision and go away. So well-meaning structures, if they don't have personal contact with individuals and bring in lateral viewpoints, are not good. All too often in our effort to be quote unquote objective, we tend to be quantitative without connection, and that's not good, whether it is counting papers or where they're published or having committees to address these kinds of issues. So there, I think a level of connectivity and subjectivity comes into play, and that's part of a very rational process. Having that link is not irrational.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vijay. So there's another question, especially for the young supervisors. Several postdoctoral fellows, when they want to become faculty, based on their experiences, they want to early on get this idea about what is it to be a mentor who is mentally supportive of their team members. So what can young supervisors do to be developing themselves into good mentors? Let's have Professor Vijay answer this, and then followed by Professor Vidita.
Well, I've noticed very many supervisors at early stages in their careers being very stressed out about every single experiment, every single move every graduate student makes, how they compare with neighboring graduate students. And, it's like constantly peering over the microscope of the students, as it were. And then these same people, 10, 5, 15, 20 years later are sitting like me, perhaps saying, how one should be relaxed. So all of us need to look back when we were starting and ask whether we practiced what we preached. Because by and large, our institutions in India have a virtue in that there is no extraordinary pressure to do to beat certain benchmarks which we arbitrarily lay. It can be a relaxed atmosphere, and much depends on way mentors, the heads of department, all of them create that environment. Some places have it, and it's amazing to see how magical it is to see what a relaxed environment can do. And other places don't. You can go into a very stressed out environment and it doesn't help. I went to a meeting in another country some time back, and the head of department called everyone together and said, you shall all be informal. And they all said, yes, sir, we shall be informal. That's not a kind of functioning which is conducive. But we really need an informal, interactive space in academia. And they, as Vidita said, should also be safe spaces.
Thank you, Professor Vijay. Professor Vidita?
Yeah, so, I don't have much more to add to what Vijay has already said. I would say that I think part of it is because the youngest PIs are also under, pressure themselves to not just prove that they can run a lab and attract money, but also, effectively deliver. I think you have to remember that it's eventually a long game. And if you invest in your people and believe in them, then different people will come true on that at different times. You can't, and you will make for a very miserable environment for you and for everyone who you're working with if you transmit all of your stress and your worries to the younger people. So my advice or input is, we've all done this and we've all I remember doing this as a young PI myself, where I was, we were trying one experiment, it was just routinely failing. And then my youngest master's student in my lab actually told me, I think you just need to take a chill pill. And literally leaving those chains of communication open sufficiently that your youngest people can actually speak directly to you and tell you, listen, I think you just need to calm down, means that you have left an environment where people will disagree with you. And if they can't disagree with you, then your science is going to suffer. And there's a direct impact of not creating an environment where your students, your postdocs can tell you, actually, I think you're completely wrong. So you do want to create that kind of a working environment. It will sustain for the longer run as a better scientific environment if you create that. So that would be my, I mean, if the eventual goal is for a team to be able to push scientific boundaries, you need to flatten the power structure as much as you can.
Thank you, Professor Vidita. Over to you, Aditya.
Yeah, thank you, Sridivya. So we have heard a bit about the role of students, how they can try to deal with their stress, how they can try to understand different component of stress. We have also heard from Professor Vijay and Professor Vidita how faculty or a mentor should probably try to, in what ways they can try to handle their students or their lab environment. I would like to ask Professor Vijay if he can shed some light on the role of institutions, as in institutions heads, in addressing these concerns of the young scholars. What are the specifics of the framework for having a system in place to address mental health problems? How can institute heads, mentors, and students contribute collectively in this regard?
Well, the short answer is enormously. All of us know walking into an institution, whether it's a welcoming place or a place which, or if you walk into a lab or a department, you can see how welcoming it is or not. When you walk in as a stranger or as an outsider, do people smile at you? Do they ask you how they can help you? Do they then try to solve your question which you have? Or are they asking, how the heck did you get inside? Who let you in? Why are you here? Go away. We can't have that person meet you. So institutional structures are set up hugely by leaders in the institute. And many PIs will complain about institutional structures, but when they become leaders, they will continue with that structure because it's much easier to stay than to change. So it's very, very important that collegiality be put in place early on. It's very difficult to bring it in later. It can be done, but it's tough. And once it is there, it takes the flip of a switch to destroy it. And that too needs institutional leadership and care to do that. I've seen many departments which have taken years to climb up in terms of collegiality, trust, overall comfort for people working. And then in the interest of trying to make it more quote unquote rigorous, all of that goes for a toss with great speed. So one has to be very careful. Leadership is very important.
Thank you, Professor Raghavan. Now, we are almost done listening to our speakers. Now we have close to 14-15 questions. We can directly move on to Q&A session. May I ask Sridivya to start this Q&A session?
Sure, Aditya. So this is for Professor John. How do you know when to visit a psychologist and when to visit a psychiatrist?
Yeah, I think that's one of the oft repeated questions or doubts that general public have about mental health professionals. Many people are not generally aware of the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists. Of course, psychiatrists are medically trained and they're also trained in various psychotherapies, whereas clinical psychologists are trained in clinical psychotherapeutic methods of helping people with various psychiatric disorders. So in my presentation, I had spoken about the importance of detecting early warning signs of distress. So at that point in time, you still do not have a primary psychiatric disorder. So that is when you would want to ensure that you speak to your close ones along with your student counselor if that's required, who in turn would probably make a referral to a clinical psychologist who would help you with various techniques to overcome these symptoms or signs of distress. You do not yet have a primary psychiatric disorder. The moment you have a primary psychiatric disorder, the early warning signs of which I had mentioned, you would want to make a decision whether to go to the outpatient clinic of a psychiatrist or to the emergency psychiatry center. But you should not be dilly-dallying between whether I should go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. This I'm saying not because of any territorial issues with clinical psychologists, but because it's already a medical condition. And then you need to do what is required acutely, or you need to do what is required medically. And then we ourselves, psychiatrists, would take the help of clinical psychologists or social work, psychiatric social workers, or family therapists to deal with the various psychological issues that the individual has, while addressing the primary psychiatric problem with medications or other interventions. So I hope that makes it amply clear as to what are the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists. They both are equally important. Not one is more important than the other in helping a given individual with a problem, but you really need to understand when you should seek help from whom.
Thank you, Professor John. So the next question is actually from Smita Jain from India Biosciences. This is for Professor Vijay. She's asking if a formal leadership or a lab management course designed for the Indian system specifically can help reducing mental health issues in academia.
You know, I completely see the value of structured interventions in these areas. They're important, rather than have people learning in a freewheeling manner as they go on. So that kind of a course structure is very important. Also, given our large numbers in many institutions and cities and groups of institutions, my office will release in a day or two an app which allows students and postdocs and indeed anyone in our environments to download that app and have access to many of the kinds of resources Dr. John pointed out. Who do we contact depending on your location? Who are the other people in your institutions? What are your institutional structures? How can they help? If your institution doesn't have a training program, where else can you go for such programs on video or elsewhere? Is there someone who needs help? So this app is a constant work in progress, but we were hoping to release it today, but we'll have some fine tuning done over there. So that will also complement the kind of structures which you pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vijay. So there's an anonymous attendee who wants to know, is it possible that good stress can be followed by bad stress? Is there something called good stress and bad stress? Professor John, your slides indeed had elaborate information on it, but would you still briefly like to differentiate between good stress and bad stress?
Yes, of course. Stress is any environmental, either external or internal challenge that an organism faces, which challenges the organism's or the individual's capacity or internal resources. So you have a certain extent of internal resources, and you have a certain challenge, which is either external or internal facing you. So if you have a particular challenge that is mounted on you by, let's say, your academic environment or whatever, and then you have the kind of resources to deal with it. You have the kind of intellectual, social, personality-wise, emotional resources to deal with it. Then you are able to channel those resources to deal with that stress and achieve your objective. And that is what is referred to as the eustress. In fact, the presence of this stress motivates and focuses you to achieve your goal better than it would have if the stress was not there. And we all have experienced this before in our lives. Now, if the fact that you've been able to meet with one deadline, two deadlines, three deadlines, and if you have an unforgiving environment, and even the best of individuals with all the resources, if they are unable to manage, then you start experiencing symptoms of distress or burnout. And those are the symptoms that I was referring to earlier. Your symptoms related to the way you are thinking, the way your emotions are, your behaviors, or even physical symptoms. So you experience any of this, then you must recognize that perhaps the work environment and the stress that I'm faced with are finally starting to take its toll on me.
Thank you, Professor John. So the next question is for Professor Vidita. What are the suggestions in terms of the, evaluating, or rather having yardsticks for productivity? How do you evaluate productivity? As of now, in research, it's mostly based on publications. Do you think are there other ways of evaluation?
Of course there are. They just require more work, and they require significantly more time. And so as a bunch of people, we tend to take the shortcuts. That's why we want quantized numbers that will give us an impact factor or a proxy value of a journal impact factor to determine what. You have to read. There's no avoiding doing the work and reading and taking the time. And actually, if you're evaluating someone's effort for 5 years or 6 years, then you have to take the time, and you have to give it the time that person presumably put in to produce that work. So I don't think there are shortcuts to this. And I think I understand the need for shortcuts. If you're evaluating large numbers at one time, it's just become the proxy measure that you use. But you have to constantly guard against it, and you have to watch that you don't, it's a very slippery slope. And the minute you start quantizing this and you start doing it, you are going to get people taking the shortcut, because it's inevitable. People don't want you looking at 50 files and you want a shortcut answer. Quickly tell me what, slides to the top. But when you're evaluating young minds, you're evaluating performance of a young lab that has just set itself up. I think you have to remember that there is a human cost to evaluation when it goes haywire and goes wrong. And that if you're sitting on those evaluation systems, then you have to watch out for that risk. So I would say there's no recipe around it other than to read and to increase the ability to sort of have multiple other measures. There are measures. I would say that there's value to 360-degree evaluation in institutions. There is absolutely value, but the corporate world has done it forever. We don't do it, and we've never done it. And we evaluate, we write, it's always the hierarchy is always one way of evaluating, which is you're evaluating people who report to you. What about allowing people who report to you to evaluate your performance? The reverse, I think that's something that the time has come, which is that we need evaluations of, for example, let's look at our administrative staff who support us. We do evaluate them. They can also evaluate whether we create environments for them as well, right? So there is room for this. And it's a radical thought, but it's one that's well worth doing. And I would say the first place to start is in the PI lab run environment, where you ask for feedback from people. And a lot of people do this. I know that when people are looking at tenure packages in many other countries, they're also asking for reference letters from collaborators. They're seeking input from students and postdocs who've been mentored by this individual to ask, what was this lab like? What was the culture of this environment like? Is this a scientifically nurturing environment? Because your output is not purely your papers and the grants that you got or the money you attracted. It's eventually a culture of science and what you sort of collectively create in your environment. So I think that would be a good start, and institutions can put it as a component of the evaluation process. It is certainly one important component.
Thank you, Professor Vidita. So there's another anonymous attendee. Actually, 2 or 3 people have asked questions around this topic. There are several situations where the lab environment and the supervisor is not able to exude that he or she is being supportive, and there is a lot of lab politics that happens. So when you are in that kind of a lab environment, what can a student do in terms of being able to sustain in that lab and still be productive in doing their research. So, Professor Vijay, would you like to take this?
Can you unmute yourself, Professor Vijay?
Yeah, sorry. I have a fundamental problem in the structure of student or postdoc PI relationships. My view is that they are those of collaborators, as opposed to people who are working for the PI's purpose. Now, when there are collaborators, there will also be stresses and strains in a laboratory environment. It's not that that's a magical solution. But those which come about in that context are much more addressable when, rather than in a situation when a PI is trying to get a team to work to their purpose and micromanage each of those kinds of tensions or ignore the tensions. So they are fundamentally two different kinds of environments. This latter environment is not conducive to a long-term solution. It's conducive to an immediate one of getting rid of people who the PI thinks is a problem or keeping someone, because the entire purpose seems to be a top-down way is, can I fix this person to be a better person? Can I get them to work for my purpose and so on? Life is much more complex, and it's not about the students and postdocs serving your purpose. So I think in addition to dealing with tensions by collegial interactions, one also needs to have fundamental change in relationships.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vijay. Along those lines, some of the attendees are asking, is it possible to incorporate capabilities of mentorship while hiring a faculty member? Is there a possibility that can be assessed?
Do you want Vidita to answer that?
Professor Vijay, you can answer that.
Again, this refers to the a broader problem in hiring, which is, supposing there are 10 people who apply for one position, and supposing that these 10 people are all excellent scientifically, right? Now you have to choose one person. Now committees, unfortunately, don't address this key point which you asked in your question. They have degenerated into a situation where they make finer and finer quantitative distinctions about these 10 people and try to line them up and choose one. This is the conflation of precision with accuracy. And this is the bane of much of our selection procedures, right from students to heads of institutions and so on. This is something which cannot be changed top down. It has to be changed culturally within the institute. And institutes which take a view, which focus on what I would call the ABC of hiring. First, you look for attitude. Then you look at the person's background. And third, you look at competence. Competence, in my view, is least important. Committees put competence at the highest importance. Then they look at the background. And then last, they look at the attitude of the person they're hiring. If you want to have a collegial environment, you must put attitude, given background and competence are there to a certain level. This requires you to address someone who's curious, to hire someone who's curious, friendly, collegial, who's got a reasonable set of publications, who will understand many subjects and learn along the way. But if you put competence first, you will count the number of papers, see where they're published, and hire that person. So that's a problem. And that's a problem which we can fix. All of us need to fix it. This is a problem which has been discussed, as far as I can see, for the last 50 years. And everyone who goes to the top continues this, while everyone below complains about this. It's changeable from within institutions. It can't be changed from outside.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Vijay. Professor Vidita, would you like to delve a little deeper and share any more thoughts on this?
No, I agree with Vijay. I think, cultures of institutions are the hardest things. The most precious things if you have the right culture in an institution. It's absolutely the most precious thing that you can sow into an institution. It is also the hardest thing to change. And it can degrade in a very short and a very rapid time if it is not preserved. So cultures of institutions are eventually made by people and the people that populate a place. And so if you pick, that certain abundance mentality, a fundamental generosity of spirit, a wish to see science as a collective enterprise, which is eventually a collaboration between multiple people, then you do create cultures that have the ability to sustain and can transmit that sort of culture down over a period of time. I've been the beneficiary of seeing something like that, which Obaid seeded at TIFA. And the fact that you could walk and wander into any lab and get reagents, and the generosity of sharing resources, which are eventually taxpayer funded resources that are collectively being given to us to do work which is a privilege for us to do, right? So that generosity of sharing resource, an abundance mentality where you don't hold everything together so tightly, worrying only about a very small little only your lab or only your group or only a few people. That broader mindset, if we don't do that, then building institutional cultures will become a serious problem down the road. And it doesn't take very long for an institutional culture to degrade. It can go like this. It's something which is worth preserving more than anything else. So I agree with Vijay completely. Picking the right people is essential.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vidita. Sorry. There is a suggestion actually. Two people have suggested that, since you did mention about having feedback from the students, trying to balance the power. So what they say is, if when there is a tenure track evaluation, is it possible to have anonymous, feedback from that lab members? Will that help in being able to, reduce the power being skewed to one side? So, Professor Vidita, would you want to just...
Yeah, and I don't think it should be only tenure track faculty. It should be across the board. When you ask for an evaluation, it can be post-tenure also. It can be leadership. It can be chairs of departments, deans of institutions, and directors. We've created systems in which we don't have evaluation in the other direction. And there has to be a way to do it such that it becomes a component of evaluation. I think it's a good idea. I also think it's a good idea at the very earliest stages when you're recruiting people to ask some questions that allow you to figure out key traits that you eventually end up valuing so much, but you don't ask questions about collegiality, collaboration. You don't ask these questions. And then over a period of time, you realize that those are characteristics that really matter in the long run. And so I think, yes, absolutely. I think it can become a component. I've certainly seen this for tenure packages from elsewhere where I've read, where I've been on an evaluation situation, I've seen students write for PIs, and it's a very powerful exercise to get an insight into how the culture of a laboratory is. So I think it's a good idea. Personally, I think it's a very good idea. I also think it's an idea whose time has come.
Great, thank you. So, Professor Vijay, maybe this one you could take this question. So, some of the people are asking if students have union in institutes, would that really help? And what exactly can the students' union do in terms of ensuring that the student concerns with mental health problems are dealt with by the institute leaders?
Well, if you look at our larger universities, they have students' unions, and many of them, even the smaller ones, have students' bodies of various kinds. You can call them unions, or you could call them whatever else. But I think there's great value in student and postdoc groupings of various kinds who are invited to non-confidential meetings of various administrative and decision-making committees as observers, for example, so that while they can learn how structured, how institutions function, while simultaneously learning how norms and functioning are important. See, let me also make a pitch on two different aspects. One, from the other side, as all of you will learn as you take on administrative positions, decision making is tough. It's not that the answer is clear. From my perspective, when I apply for a job, it's clear I feel I should be taken. But a committee looking at 10 people, looking at promotion or my comprehensive exam or someone else, has to make hard decisions. And no matter how much you succeed, have a process, or how much of an institutional culture you have, people have to make decisions. Some will be happy, some will be unhappy. And many ways of institutional functioning are such that everyone is more or less unhappy as opposed to everyone being more or less happy. So these are realities which we must also understand. That's why, the more things change, the more they seem to remain the same. But the other aspect we must keep in mind, which has not been brought up by anyone, is over the last 30 years or so, the composition of our student and to a great extent our faculty bodies also have changed dramatically. You have a wider representation geographically, in gender in some cases, even though a lot needs to be done, and in terms of economic strata. This means that institutions can seem even more, overbearing to people who come from families where they are the first people to enter university or the first people to do PhDs and so on and so forth. That number is large. And therefore, institutions need to be much more attentive to the difficulties students have in assimilating in terms of language, cultural background, living, and all those issues, which are not trivial for students coming from different parts of the country to another institution, particularly women. So these matters need to have a much greater attention.
Thank you, Professor Vijay. So a lot of questions are around this topic of what is your advice, what is the panel's advice on destigmatizing mental health problems? How can one be ensured in the system that when they go and report that they have a mental health problem and they need a break, there is no effect on their job? So it's not like, they're finally kind of set aside as a person who is not competent. Professor Vidita, would you like to answer on this?
Far better handled by Professor John, because he would, I think legally you cannot, when someone informs you of this, that would be really a real dereliction of responsibility to, have a punitive action against someone. This is a real serious issue, but I think it'd be far better answered by Professor John. So
Sure. Yeah. Professor John?
Yeah, this is not a very easy question to answer. See, on the one hand, there are the requirements of a premier institute like NCBS in maintaining a certain standard, or TIFR or other centers, where you need to maintain a certain level of proficiency, efficiency at your work, and you need to ensure that the overall work does not become lax because of inefficiency of certain cogs in the wheel. Of course, Dr. Vidita was mentioning about how we are, using taxpayers' money in doing the kind of work that we need to do. Therefore, we have a commitment to the society. And on the other hand, we also have the commitment to the young researchers who find themselves in a very difficult predicament, having to deal with all the distress and the difficulties associated with being in such a very competitive and demanding environment. So how do we strike the balance? It's not something which I think most centers of the world have succeeded in striking the right balance. So whatever I'm going to be suggesting is not going to be a perfect solution, but where we could make a start would be to make sure that each PI and each lab be sensitive to the effects of distress that I was referring to earlier. So is this a student of mine, is this research scholar finding it difficult to deal with the kind of demands that are placed on him or her? Is the person frequently not able to meet deadlines? Is the person having frequent absenteeism or making mistakes in whatever that they are doing? So rather than immediately castigating that person as a bad person or as a bad scholar, maybe it would be useful for us to probably just have a one-on-one discussion with the student in question and then see what's happening in their lives. So because we have picked up the signs of distress, so therefore it is important for a PI to be aware of the signs of distress or burnout in students and pick them up early, have a one-on-one discussion before it becomes too late and then progresses on to more serious primary psychiatric disorders. Of course, sometimes, as I was pointing out, sometimes we do have a situation wherein the genetic diathesis is very high and the stress need not necessarily have to be too high for them to go into a psychiatric disorder, in which case you need to really pick those students up who would require additional interventions. Having support groups of faculty, of PIs, support groups of faculty who could potentially step in other than the PI in question can also be at the next level, wherein the PI feels that, okay, this person requires some mentoring. So I have a conflict of interest here. Let me just make a referral to this support group. Having a support group of students, a peer group is again very important. I'm not going into details of this because it will take a lot of time. So peer group support at multiple levels, PI being sensitive to the initial signs of distress and making sure that the corrective measures are taken very early before it's too late.
Thank you, Professor John. The next question, I think you could continue to answer. So since you did mention about having support groups for these kind of students, is it possible for an individual to identify early on, based on some kind of traits, that when they take up when they put themselves into situations where there may be prolonged stressful incidents, like in research, like how the others mentioned, there's repetitive failures of experiments. Is it possible to identify early on, are there characteristics, and if at all, if there are, what can they do to build their mental resilience?
Okay, I think this is a concept which continues with what Professor Vijayaraghavan was mentioning about looking for the right attitudes in whoever you are recruiting. So it's a collaborative process between the student who decides what he or she wants from their life, what are their interests, what is their passion. So when you have a passion for a particular field, a particular experiment, a particular area of research, then a lot of adversities are perceived as eustress by the individual. And therefore the person would be able to manage the stress better. But if you end up in the wrong lab, the wrong area of research, and minor stress could be perceived as distress. So therefore, it is very important for the student. So it's a collaborative effort. The student really needs to take a call as to what is important, what are they so passionate about in their lives. At the same time, the PI who would recruit the student would also want to look at the ABCs, as Professor Vijayaraghavan was mentioning, the attitude, the background, and the competence. So therefore, if you just look at how many publications the student comes to your lab with, then you might miss out on the major attributes which would enable the student to cope better with the lab environment.
Yeah, thank you, Professor John. I think that kind of covers more or less all the questions. As we're running short of time, let's move to the next segment. So I call upon Aditya to take us to the next segment.
Thank you, Sridivya, for moderating this Q&A session. And thank you all the speakers for answering them. So we have come to a conclusion of today's webinar. And can I request Professor Vijay just to summarize all of these in, say, 2 to 3 minutes before we go to our vote of thanks session?
Thank you, Aditya. That's a very minor burden you put on me. Well, let me start in a reverse order and say that what Dr. John has pointed out are the physiological and the neurobiological underpinnings of how our environment interacts with us in our society, and how one can be in various kinds of distress. The important point from that is that many of the aspects he described almost all of them, every one of us would have felt at some time or the other. So it's not unusual to have these kinds of events. His point is that when they start going towards a direction where they are chronic, one should have access to help, seek help, and be pointed to help in a variety of ways, either in terms of counseling or in terms of treatment and so on. That's very important. And therefore, a social structure which does that needs to be in place. That social structure is very challenging. Large families earlier provided that structure. Smaller institutions provided that structure. As our family sizes have shrunk, as demands on performance seem to have put a greater stress, as our institutions have grown, these kinds of mechanisms of pointing people in the right direction become tougher. So it's incumbent on each of us to form a mentoring community. Particularly, I can't stress the importance of this in a situation where students, researchers, people from our institutions come from very, very varied backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and adjustment becomes an enormous component. To each of us coming from small towns, villages, into these institutions, it can be a frightening experience. So it's all the more important to be inclusive and interactive in that. The next point, which has come out from what Vidita has pointed out, is the importance of institutional structures of every kind. Safe spaces for women are particularly important, and also collegial environments which allow time for people to mature, and structures which are more collaborative in their interactions rather than demanding. She pointed out how institutional cultures take time being built, are easy to diminish in multiple ways, and therefore they must be valued enormously for that reason. The last point is about looking at what the trajectories of those under distress are. Just as for any other kind of distress, a physical illness of various kinds, it takes time to heal. Mental distress also falls into that category. But the trajectory, just as in certain kinds of physical illnesses, certain kinds of mental stresses can take a much longer trajectory. Institutional environments must be very accommodative of that. There must be flexible periods for studentships and postdoctoral fellowships, and for even mentors when they are stressed, for them to take it easy or take a different trajectory or take some time off. And flexibility there is critically important. There too, institutions must find innovative ways to look at that. To end, I would say both culture of institutions and putting in processes are important. One is not sufficient, but both are together sufficient and both are necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Raghavan. We thank all of the panel members for discussing vital aspects of the problem in depth. Your presence today is highly encouraging for all of us, and it helps us continue in our endeavors. We hope that it was a learning experience for all of us. We would like to extend our thanks to Bliss Communication Office, Mr. Chandrakant and Pavitra, India Biosciences and team Smita, Lakshmi, Mayuri and Karishma for the help, Rashmi from NCBS for the concept design and all other members of the PDFA Association, Nikhil Ratna from NIMANS, and all other members who have contributed to this session. Now, I would ask Sri Divya to make a small announcement before we could wrap up this webinar.
Yeah, thank you all again, once again. We try to address most of the questions. If there's anything missing, try to post it on YouTube and we'll see if we can get the answers for you. So just before we wrap up, the announcement that Aditya was mentioning is we are conducting the 4th National Postdoctoral Symposium in February 2021 in the virtual mode. So we request national postdocs and senior PhDs to apply for the symposium. Further details will be announced on the Twitter handle @NPDSpost very soon. And for queries, you could also reach us at npdsindia@gmail.com. Many thanks to all of you again. Have a great evening. I request the panel members to stay online for just 2 more minutes. Pavitra, let us know when we are off the live.